If you think about classic black and white or sepia-toned photography of the American West, your mind may well land in the early and mid-20th century with the overwhelming landscapes of Ansel Adams or the intimate Great Depression portraits of Dorothea Lange. Perhaps you think back to the 19th century work of William Henry Jackson or Edward Curtis. Few, however, would think of Timothy O'Sullivan. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink. This episode we speak with writer Robert Sullivan about his book, Double Exposure, Resurveying the West with Timothy O'Sullivan, America's most mysterious war photographer. His were photographs that consistently captured scenes that most others avoided. His story and photography cast the West in fascinating new lights. For new listeners, here's a brief introduction to the podcast and myself. Writing Westward is a monthly podcast featuring conversations with historians, journalists, scientists, and scholars from various disciplines who are writing about the North American West. The goal of these exchanges is to spark your curiosity to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the peoples who have called it home. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and I'm a Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation. I am the host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and I'll take any excuse to read more and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. If you have a moment, please subscribe and leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Share links with friends and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X, Twitter, and send in some feedback. At the end of the episode, I will include some more information about my own scholarship and the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. And with that, let me introduce who we are talking to this month and why. Robert Sullivan is a writer and journalist with a long track record of contemplative and thought-provoking work. He has written for The New Yorker, New York Times, Vogue, and A Public Space, among other outlets. He is a New York Times best-selling author multiple times over, with titles including The Meadowlands, Wilderness Adventures at the Edge of a City, A Whale Hunt, How a Native American Village Did What No One Thought It Could, Rats, Observations on the History and Habitat of the City's Most Unwanted Inhabitants, Cross Country, 15 years and 90,000 miles on the roads and interstates of America with Lewis and Clark, The Thoreau You Don't Know, What the Prophet of Environmentalism Really Meant, and My American Revolution, A Modern Expedition Through History's Forgotten Battlegrounds. In recognition of these works and to promote more, he was awarded the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship in General Nonfiction in 2022. Sullivan has also taught at the Macaulay Honors College at the City University of New York's Hunter College and at Middlebury College's summer graduate Bread Loaf of School English program. His most recent book, published in 2024 by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and that we discussed today, is Double Exposure, Resurveying the West with Timothy O'Sullivan, America's most mysterious war photographer. In this book, Sullivan traveled around the American West, revisiting sites photographed in the 1860s and 70s by Timothy O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan is best known for his haunting photographs of Civil War battlefields, but his extensive subsequent work in places like Death Valley, the Great Basin, the Grand Canyon and Desert Southwest, and other locations is relatively unknown. Employed by different expeditions, he captured striking scenes of desolation, emptiness, and danger. His life and work invites us to re-examine Western landscapes and how human activities upon them link the region to broader continental historical narratives, many of a troubling nature. Double Exposure is an excellent example of how creative writing and creative approaches to thinking about past and present can unsettle our assumptions about the West and force us to view them through new lenses, both literal and figurative. Robert Sullivan, welcome to Writing Westward.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to dig into this book a little bit and to talk about your experiences on the road. out here in the West. So I thought maybe we'd start with if you could tell us a little bit about before your life as a writer, which has brought you out West quite a bit. Did you have a personal relationship with the region? Did you think about it in unique ways as an identity, as an idea, as a landscape? Before you started writing about it,
Mhm.
what did you think of the West?
Yeah. Wow. I just finished writing an essay. Somebody asked me to write an essay about a high school teacher that mattered to you. And it was crazy that I was asked that, and that I wrote about this high school teacher after I wrote this book that is, yes, about the West. Um, but and so that would have been I would have had this high school teacher in 10th grade. He was my earth science teacher. But that's a kind of recovered memory, I guess you could say, of the West, because if you had asked me before I wrote this essay like 2 weeks ago, that same question, I would have said, I really had I had no personal experience in the West. I grew up, I'm the oldest of 6 kids very much in the East. Grew up in New York. In high school, we moved to New Jersey, or when I was in high school, junior high school. And then I went to college. I went to 3 colleges in 4 years for some reason. And I went to Gettysburg, which is kind of interesting in terms of the Civil War, I suppose. And I went to Boston University, and then I went to Georgetown University for 2 years because I kind of fell in love with politics. But then accidentally at Georgetown, fell in love with kind of playwriting and writing. And actually, I took an incredible course about writing in the 19th century and American art in the 19th century, landscape painting in particular. And that's what really opened me up to like, what is the picture of America? Like who imagines what America looks like? And it was amazing in DC, the National Gallery was there. And so I would go out and look at these paintings after we'd read, Mark Twain or whoever, Stephen Crane. And so that idea of writing and picturing things was really, I was so excited by that class, but I really only ever wanted to be a jazz drummer. And so college was about giving up that idea. And we're not going to, I know, have time to get into West Coast versus East Coast jazz here, but really I had never been west of Eastern Pennsylvania in my entire life. And then after working as a newspaper reporter after college, I got a job at a magazine, Fact Checking, a travel magazine. And the editor asked me to write a piece about, the editor was Harry Evans, the editor of the London Times. He came to America to run a travel magazine. And he said, Bob, we need a sidebar about the American interstate and all you can see from the interstate. And I did some research, and that day I realized there was a waterfall, the highest waterfall in North America. It was in Oregon, right off the highway, right off I-84. And I came back, I got in the elevator to go to lunch after I was telling Harry this, incredible Harry. And he was an historian of photography, really. Harry Evans, the editor of the London Times, and deep interest in photography, wrote a lot about photography, American photography, all kinds of photography. But anyway, when I got in the elevator, a woman who was on the elevator had a beaded belt that said Multnomah Falls. And not too many months later, we got married. And not too many months after that, we moved to Oregon. Now, she's from Oregon. I never would have dreamed of living in Oregon. But given that we had grandmothers on both coasts, one in Oregon and one in the East, I was then, basically for 10 and many years after that, drive the continent a lot.
Mm-hmm. Back and forth, back and forth.
Yeah, but also I was assigned pieces as a magazine writer working in Portland, Oregon, who had no idea where I was. I was assigned pieces all the time, mostly by New York editors who would say, now you're in Oregon, that's pretty close to Nevada, right? Can you get there like this afternoon? And I would say, sure.
If it's a job, the answer is
yes.
yes.
Pay gas? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But you were by default then their Western correspondent in a way.
Just
by virtue of the fact that you happen to move there.
Yeah, I'm intimate with the kind of East Coasters, New Yorker, the gross caricature of the New Yorker who knows nothing else of the world. I'm intimate with that. It has no geographical kind of knowledge or even so yeah, I was able to kind of like take advantage of that and really explore. But amazing that I went out with that idea of like that America paints itself, that America writes itself, that project of writing America. It's exciting that this is called Writing Westward. You could almost argue that that's a story, that's a version of a story of the United States, writing Westward. I mean, another Sullivan was the guy who was the editor of the Democratic Review who coined the term or helped coin the term manifest destiny.
Yeah.
But but my high school English teacher, who I wrote the essay about, he was a geologist, and I only just realized that he was that he studied some mountains outside of Santa Fe, and then came back to us and taught high school in the town he grew up in. But Ola told us these amazing stories about the West, about the geology of New Mexico, and I was so inspired by him. And he taught us to use. We had a project that he called That Dam Project, and in 10th grade we dammed the Passaic River in North Jersey and continued to flood where we lived, and shaded in higher and higher topo, contour until we were back to the original glacial lake. And that is basically like, that was such a beautiful thing to think about and learn about. And, I mean, it's basically like trying to draw the glacial lakes that were Lake Lahontan, or, that were the Great Basin lakes again. So that was such a beautiful project in helping you understand where you are and in understanding that water is everything. So I never realized. So in the end, I was so inspired by him.
This actually explains a lot. I was going to mention how, you've written on a lot of topics, and you kind of have a modus operandi of, it seems like you like to get out there and experience the landscape or experience the historical narrative by retracing, the steps, like you did like the Lewis and Clark expedition, via road trip, or, you went up to the Macaw Nation in Washington and as they were doing whale hunts, like your book on the Meadowlands, like you like to be out there. And so maybe that geology teacher kind of planted these ideas, these seeds of like the importance of understanding landscape.
I mean, I tried to convince both of our kids to get like jobs as geologists out in the field or ecologists, and I failed both times. But I still love them more than anything, and they're both actually great writers and teachers, and so it's all. They made much better choices than I, of course, would offer them. But no, my books would seem to be about wildly different things, but the really boring term for what I'm doing is kind of like landscape histories or site histories, this book. Well, some things just happen by assignments. Like the book that I wrote about the macaw and their whale hunt was by accident. I mean, I had been thinking about the fact that the macaw were thinking about whale hunting again after decades of not hunting. And weirdly, a reporter or an editor called up from the New York Times and said, "Could you write a short piece about this? Just like 3,000 words, 2,500 words. And take a couple weeks." Well, it took a year to write that. And yeah, I wanted to go up to the place. And it's always been that same thing. I mean, I started as a newspaper reporter. Like, you show up in a little town or a big town and you try to figure out where you are. And you try to, you sort of assume that you have no idea where you are. And how can you get some sense of where you are? And knowing that you can't get a sense of where you are, that's, like that there's a community of people who have the deepest sense of where they are. And part of that sense comes from their continuity in that place, and their struggles in that place. So, and that's become more clear to me as I've added the decades onto my own life. So one of the big things is like how can I be in a place and feel a place, know a place, get some glimpse of a place. But the second thing is, like the thing that really compelled me early on, the Meadowlands book, is about a completely trashed, to put it grossly, area of New Jersey, which is where they had all these dumps, flaming dumps until the 60s, but just all of New York City dumped its waste there. Huge, acres, hundreds and hundreds of acres of trash that was right outside the metro area that every metro region has, in a sense. And it's in, as often is in metro areas, where you build airports or throw dumps in marshes, which of course are the most productive ecological places. So really, looking at the Meadowlands, it was like trying to talk about that, trying to experience that, but also trying to, that whole idea that some places are natural and some places aren't. And that comes from my very first, college English, extravagant, beautiful experience. It was like, wait a minute, why is this special? Why did the Hudson River landscape painters say that this is beautiful and sort of ignore the logging? Oh, what is beauty, or what is nature? And part of my thing is like, nature's completely made up, and it's not, and we've used it in bad ways, maybe some good ways. So it's kind of, so those two things, like, how do we talk about any particular site or place? How do people experience places? But also in a kind of deeply boring way that I feel free to talk about and have a fun time with here. Why is it that some places are valued over others? That's been the enduring question for me. And I really, of course, am working, like, you can't tell me any place is more valuable than another.
It's all about what we project on it. We project cultural values and things on landscapes. So this book on Timothy O'Sullivan then really seems to be a culmination of like a lot of these things, because this is really you're basically, without name dropping your own book, just describing kind of what the project was about understanding sites and then thinking critically about how they were viewed historically and how we view them today.
Well, I think there's that idea that that you're not going to move forward unless you understand the past. That you're not trying to understand how people in the past saw the places helps you understand how we got to where we are today. And here was this person whose photographs I fell in love with when I met my wife, who I also fell in love with, maybe not coincidentally, but she had she had a degree in photography. She was a photographer, and she introduced me to the survey photographers. She also introduced me to the resurvey projects of the 1970s and 80s. Mark Klett, who's an amazing photographer, and a bunch of other photographers went out and rephotographed some of the original USGS photographers who were working with the Army. So this guy O'Sullivan, Timothy O'Sullivan, who, yes, is kind of the most famous Civil War photographer. Often his photos are tagged as Brady photographs, but he took the most profound photographs at Gettysburg, for instance, of the battlefield dead. Just incredible photographs, often of almost nothing. And then he went west and made these photos. And so, yeah, this is a culmination in the sense that, well, it's also, I never wanted to write about anything Irish due to the fact that I grew up in an Irish American family in New York, and all of a sudden people hear singing and leprechauns and weird songs and beer, and so I didn't want to get into that. But this guy had no story, and he's famous as he is unknown. But he appears to have come from Ireland at around the time of the famine, and to follow his path through America, and then to see him get behind a camera, and then to think about photography, but more importantly, to think about the way photographs in that time, wet plate photographs, were made in this kind of liquid idea of catching the world on a plate of silver and liquid gun cotton, like all the stuff of the war and of mining. capturing the light of the world. It just got better and better the more I drove around the West End, and would often take out, over the course of decades, take out his photographs and look at these sites and think about these sites.
Does viewing of these sites through his photography change how you viewed those landscapes or thought about them or interacted with them, as opposed to just other general landscapes you drove by?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because I guess I can say that the kind of exercise or the job I assigned myself of imagining him photograph these sites changed how I saw these sites, because, and on the one hand, he's coming with this kind of military scientific team apparatus. Like they're looking at these sites with intent to map, to survey, to find new mining spots, to open up a kind of West, or to close off other kinds of Wests. So thinking about how imagery was a part of that. So now I'm looking at a giant sandstone formation, and whereas, I so remember driving, I can see it. It runs like a Super 8 film in my head, driving right before Christmas in the winter of like 90 or 91, I guess it was 90. And we're driving west with a U-Haul or a Ryder truck, all our stuff, and it's getting dark, and we're making that turn kind of south of Salt Lake, I guess south of Provo, but we're turning up to get the road up into, that's going to go up to Salt Lake, the interstate there. What's that one? The odd
The
number.
15, I-15.
So we're turning there, and we're going to stay in a motel. Now it's getting late. We're not driving late because my wife has a baby in the car. We have walkie-talkies. We're talking to each other. I'm in the Ryder truck. And, seeing those sandstone formations on the side and just thinking, this is gorgeous. This is beautiful. This landscape is speaking to me about the kind of fear I have of moving, but also the kind of intimacy of us in two cars close to each other, which might not sound that intimate, but we're in tight communication, but then however many years later, 35 years later, 40 years later, I guess 30 years later, there's that Devil's Slide along, is it 80?
That's on the 84.
And, pulling off the exit, stopping there, all the traffic rushing by us. We're not moving. We're just driving back from seeing her parents. We're driving back east. And the sort of violence of the interstate at that time, passing us. So I'm trying to pull off and not get killed and see the Devil's Slide, and thinking, oh, this is what the surveys, this is what's born of the surveys, an interstate highway with trucks going by and all of the machinery of America. And half the trucks have, are carrying some kind of liquid gas or something that's been mined and is a result of, the first the guy who commissioned the photos, O'Sullivan's photos of Devil's Slide, was a geologist and was looking to make investments for himself, but also to set up a mining apparatus for the United States of America. So extraction, using photos to extract things, whether it be, money from tourists or taxes from, or no taxes from mining companies.
We don't think critically enough about visual media. When we consume visual media, be it photographs or paintings or whatever, I don't think we spend enough time thinking about the context in which they were produced, because sometimes they're produced for very specific reasons, which may be excluding as much from the picture as they are including, right? Like, what did they not photograph? So thinking about Western landscapes through the lens, I mean, no pun intended, of like a historical photographer, and then revisiting, I think this is a really powerful exercise that could retrain how we view landscapes today as well.
And not what are they not picturing was huge.
Yeah.
And there's a book, I'm trying to remember the name of the book. Well, yeah, what they're not picturing is huge. What's being left out of the photo. But what's really, to me, what's most captivating about O'Sullivan is how his photos, some of his, I'm just going to say it, coolest photos are of what appears to be nothing. his photo of the Salt Lake Desert. So he would have taken it like kind of down, like on I-80. I mean,
Like
surely,
Bonneville Salt Flats kind of
yeah,
area.
as
Yeah.
the salt flats become the lake, kind of. So he's somewhere in that interstitial area or right at the lake. Hard to say. And I don't know what as I'm thinking of it now, I'm sure I've looked it up, but I don't know what historically, where I guess the lake would have been higher in 1868, 67.
Probably. Yeah. Well, definitely higher than it is now.
Now, but not
Yeah.
but like I remember when you couldn't see Spiral Jetty in the 90s.
Yeah. 80s and 90s is kind of a real high point, and
Right.
it's declined since.
So
But
that
back then, I don't think it would have been that high. I don't
So,
know.
yeah.
Perhaps so.
but it's yeah. So
But in
anyway,
that photo, there's nothing in the photo. It's
there's
just
nothing in the photo.
a blank, flat desert landscape.
It's such a gutsy photo, and the bosses took it. The bosses used it. He's just a worker. He's a freelance writer. I mean, and like a freelance photographer, and that's how I can enter into his world, is think like, oh yeah, I've worked for people who want this kind of piece or that kind of piece. And you might want to do this, but they don't want that. And you have to buy food and pay for rent. And so you need to do something that, or you can not eat and not pay rent. But it's such a gutsy move to make that photograph. And I don't know if the bosses took it in desperation, but maybe not, because it kind of fits in with the spectacular. There's something spectacular about the nothing. But you also get to think about him as a soldier, as someone who was in the war in the East. And I kind of posit, I hope to present the idea that he's traveling with the war in him. And when he sees something like that, well, how does he see and how does he feel? Because we always, I mean, as you said, we bring things to a site. We bring things to how we see something. And, and weirdly, it took me a long time to get to go to that, to try to look at that photo and go to the lake and think about it in a kind of particular way. I mean, I'd driven by many, many times, but to go with this project in mind. And when I went, I found it, super. It happened to be that it was very emotional to go and look at that photograph, and you should definitely intend some puns, because, one of the things that drives me a little crazy is there are a lot of very smart people out in the world writing very smart things, but words like lens is a word that can slow the average person down if they're just trying to get to work in the morning, and you want them to think critically about how views of the West have shaped modern America and are going to affect the ballot box in the next election or whatever. But when you start saying words like lens, as I do, then they're like, what do you mean lens? But the great thing about this Sullivan is, when I say lens, you can think lens if you like. You
Literal.
can think of it. Yeah, literally. Yeah. Or you can think of it as like, when we talk about gaze or lens, makes perfect sense, but it might preclude a larger number of people from thinking about something. However, I write way too many words, so nobody can make it past the first page of anything I do. So, but yeah, it's literally a lens.
I mean, the Salt Lake Desert photo is fascinating too, because I don't know if we can really tell what direction he's facing. You can see some low hills far off in the background, but if you go
it's
out
gotta
there,
be north or east or west, right?
I think out towards the lake, maybe.
Yeah.
Because if he turned west, there's some really dramatic, craggy little ridge lines and mountains that come down into the valley there. That there was what we might say more interesting things that he could have turned in any direction and probably photographed.
Yeah.
But he chose to photograph the emptiness.
Yeah. But there's that other amazing thing. Yeah. And that choosing what to photograph, right? Yeah. And they had a limited number of these plates. So just to say it, just so that all the listeners out there know, because you need to know this, listeners, the wet plate photographic process meant that a photographer in 1868, during the Civil War, and in these first days of U.S. surveys, would take a piece of glass plate, like a window that you would glaze into your I guess like about 10 by 13 or something, 14, rectangular plate, or any shape really, but rectangular plate. And then you would bevel the edges so it holds a little bit of liquid on the top. But you really had to balance the liquid on top the way you fill your coffee too much and walk slowly across the room. But you first flowed the plate with with collodion, which is liquid cotton or nitrocellulose, which is also used as a propellant in gunfire. So that's something, and it's made of cotton. So that's something that kind of is representative of the United States experience. So you already have explosives and cotton that are the makeup of this photograph. But anyway, you've got this liquid. Now you've flowed the plate. It's smoothly covered. It's a real trick, but you've covered the plate with that. And then you put it in a light, you get into a light sealed tent. So there's a dark room tent. There's no light coming in, and you treat it with silver nitrate with a silver solution. Now it's activated. You put it into a light, tight box, and you rush it over to your camera. It's all set up. You throw the box in the camera, and you, through a special seal and a latch, pull out the thing that blocks the, there's a black plate that blocks any light from coming into the box. Now the box is part of the camera. So you pull up the black plate, and now inside the camera, the lens, as soon as you open it, light's going to come in and hit this ready to go plate. And when you open up the lens of the camera, and all of the light of the world kind of fills in this inside the camera, inside the kind of room of the camera, it hits the plate. It reacts with the silver, speaking of mining and extraction, and it creates an image. And when you watch this, then you quickly rush it back into its dark place, and you rush over to another dark tent, and you develop it. And when you watch this develop in a dark tent, it's first of all, it develops kind of upside down probably when you're doing it. And second of all, it sort of appears slowly in a kind of ghostly way. It absolutely seems like magic. That's something we need to tell people.
Well, and also, I mean, we grew up in an era where like we had film cameras where, I remember as a kid, like, okay, I have 24 shots on this camera, and we didn't have a lot of money for like developing roll after roll of film. And so you had to be so picky about, okay, what is this worth a picture or not? So multiply that by a million, right?
Yeah.
In terms of how labor intensive and intentional he and other photographers had.
And now you get to go back and look at your high school pictures and say, was that really worth?
I know. I was like, oh man.
But yeah, no, that and so if he made a mistake, he could scratch the image off. After you develop it, you set it with a varnish, but you could scratch it off and use the plate again.
Mm-hmm.
If
they didn't like how it came out. Yeah.
Yeah. And many photographers would use two images. So you might photograph the sand formation, or you might photograph the lake, and you might say, I want to have clouds in the sky. And so you would photograph clouds in the sky, and you put those two plates together. But O'Sullivan didn't do that. Like he let it wash out, which is also, there's a very with O'Sullivan, he's so interesting because he produces so much work. He appears to work really hard. People talk about how hard he works. At the beginning, photographers like Ansel Adams saw his stuff and were amazed by it visually, but thought that he was kind of a hack or he wasn't doing a great job. But as time goes on, people like Ansel Adams are more and more captivated by his proficiency and by his ability to work in incredibly complicated environmental situations like in rain and heat and desert and Death Valley, and still make this stuff happen. So he was an apprentice in Matthew Brady's studio. It's just really interesting. He's what I call a pro. I'm especially as I enter my late early 60s. No, wait, especially in my 60s. I'm like, that person's really good at what they do. They've done it a long time. I'm so impressed by that. And this guy, at only 30, whatever, he was a pro.
Yeah.
He could get the shot, which is so something.
I'm curious about some of his uniqueness, which you've already touched on a little bit, because I'm interested in how the public back then would have viewed like landscape photography of the West different than landscape paintings. The paintings also take lots of intentionality and even longer, to finish. But whereas a lot of those, the Rocky Mountain School, Thomas Moran, Albert Bierstadt, like they were painting the most majestic, dialing everything up to 11 that they could in their representations of the West. And some other early photographers were also more focused on kind of like the majesty and aesthetics of the landscape.
Yeah, Watkins in Yosemite.
Yeah, that's not Sullivan.
No.
And his stuff, like we already said, with this one of the Salt Lake Desert, there's not much there.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit, maybe we can jump into like this. He goes on this expedition led by Clarence King as the U.S. Geological Survey of the 40th parallel of the Great Basin or something like that in 1867. Yep. But it's a unique expedition in that it was led with civilians, but funded by the Army.
Yep. Well, it's a civilian scientist, Clarence King, who's a geologist, who's a kind of a famous geologist, but about to become very famous because he kind of points out a big diamond fraud before it happens, but he becomes world famous for saving a whole bunch of investors in California and in New York from losing their shirts. So he becomes super famous. Like Longfellow wanted to meet Clarence King, that kind of famous. That's right. I'm talking poet wanted to meet you famous. Anyway, speaking of inside baseball, but famous. And so he convinces Congress to let him use an Army survey team. So there's this guy Humphrey who runs the Army Corps of Engineers, a Civil War veteran, as most people are. Anybody in the Army is at that time. But and King, interestingly, went west from a very wealthy family in the East, which was quickly getting unwealthy. But he was from a wealthy family in the East in Rhode Island, and he went west to serve his country by surveying mountains. But if you read his diaries, it's more like he was kind of just having a good time climbing mountains. It's hard to see how he was serving his country, but he believed he was, or so he writes. He was once kind of arrested or stopped as a draft evader on a boat trip in Canada before he went surveying in the West. But it's interesting that many of his friends served in the war, but he goes west to do this. He's not a soldier, and he leads a bunch of soldiers, including O'Sullivan, who's might have actually had a position in the Army as a lieutenant, but either way, it was with soldiers for the whole war, and kind of knows the ways of the Army. So King takes him out. He's a civilian scientist, but he's going to sell his so he wants to make an incredible map of America, a geologic map and geologic history of America that will rival European geologic histories of the Swiss Alps and all that stuff. And he's going to do that. And he eventually does it. And it's it takes years and years for King to do it. And it's so not remembered immediately after it's published. But the way King's going to do that is he's going to make this first thing, and it's going to be about mining in the Comstock region in Nevada, where the Comstock lode was. And so every miner is going to line up to pay for that, as is every congressional, supporter of miners, or frankly, senator who's in cahoots, often secretly and illegally, with mining concerns. So that's going to make King lucrative. That's his lucrative decision to then finance his science.
So that's the purpose of this expedition.
Yes.
For which O'Sullivan is being tasked to take pictures.
Yes. And King's got this King believes in that art and science are next to each other. King's a kind of science that will fade out, that's about to fade out. We're about to go all to the lab, and, field research is important, but King believes that the observation of the scientist and what they see in the field, and with an artistic eye that we would kind of shiver at, maybe if you're, in a science grad student today, maybe wrongly in some ways. But anyway, it's an outdated kind of science, but he's a kind of king of it. Got all these very interesting ideas of I can prove that science is right, but so is the Bible. He's trying to do all these things that are really hard and complicated. So O'Sullivan, it's interesting that he chooses this practical guy who he maybe didn't want. King didn't want O'Sullivan, maybe. Maybe he wanted Watkins, because he did some stuff with Watkins, who's more famous and beautiful things. King seems to see that O'Sullivan gets the shot that shows what he's talking about in terms of the geologic formation of the West, and which King is off on in terms of current theory, geologic theory. But yeah, and then there's two expeditions, because the second expedition that O'Sullivan goes on is with a Lieutenant Wheeler, who is, and you can just cut to the chase and say, though he's an Army guy, he's got no experience in leading surveys. The one survey he did lead, everybody got lost and was hungry by the end. And he basically,
this one doesn't go much better in some ways.
No, and it goes very badly. They go to Death Valley at the height of summer. People start getting tuberculosis, and they're coming down with it incredibly there, maybe because they have no water and symptoms are brought up. I can't quite figure it out. And they hang people. It's very bad. They shoot people. It's all bad. And that lieutenant, who's trying to sell his expedition as incredible and beautiful and noteworthy, really nothing about it is noteworthy. And years later, an incredible historian named Doris Doughty will show that it was all a fraud, all a scam, and that everybody, including O'Sullivan, had to sign documents to say, we're not going to say anything about this, while Wheeler makes all these mining claims in cahoots with, I think, a Virginia congresswoman who will later set up a segregated suburban subdivision. But anyway, so yeah.
So Sullivan's, he's not just out there taking the pictures necessarily that he wants to take. Like, he has a job to do.
Absolutely.
What's interesting, in some ways, his photographs, especially the Civil War ones, are incredibly famous, but we don't know much about him as a person. But then lots of these photographs that he produces in this 1867 and 1871 expeditions are not published. They're not shared with the public. Why is that? I mean, it's going to be different for the two expeditions. Was it because they didn't have the aesthetic value that maybe the public would have gobbled up?
It's interesting. Just as you're asking now, I'm thinking, well, with the Wheeler basically just wants to, in a way, it's like, publish everything you can. I want people to think that I'm doing this amazing job of exploring, even if I'm exploring places that have been explored already. I don't care. Just publish everything you have. And O'Sullivan, in a way, takes advantage of that. And even returns to a site that he photographed with King. He returns to Shoshone Falls.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, very interesting. Like, I don't think anybody can explain exactly how he convinces Wheeler to let him travel from, mid New Mexico all the way back up to Idaho, or what is say Idaho. But it's very interesting because we get to see him return to a site after so many years in the West. But I think a good example of what you're talking about is, and when you see Carlton Watkin make the photos of Yosemite, there are very often no, Native Americans there. There are no indigenous people, even though there are. And that's a big notable leave out. Same with the railroads. When he's taking photos for King, you don't see Chinese immigrants working on the railroad. You don't really see Irish immigrants either. And that, I think I note that thanks to the British Empire, which kept down labor costs on both sides of the continent, thanks to the British Opium Wars, and thanks to the Irish famine, you have these two groups working and fighting towards each other, and we're working towards each other on the railroads. But I think the kind of the easiest way to show your point is with the Comstock mines, and O'Sullivan photographs miners in the mines, and
which at the time was
nobody had ever done it. There'd been one mining photo. There'd been one photo in a cave in Kentucky, I think, a few months maybe before. But now Sullivan's photographing in a mine after a mine explosion.
Yeah.
Holy, oh man. Anyway, and he's photographing what is brutal work right after a giant, cave-in. And those photos, well, and it turns out many of the miners are probably from Ireland, definitely Cornish and Welsh, and also that if you start reading the newspapers from the town in Ireland where the miners came from, people are writing about labor issues in Nevada and in Michigan. And there's this incredibly quick and tight correspondence between workers around basically across the oceans, which is really illuminating.
And is highlighting bad working conditions and giving fuel to labor organizing maybe not the kind of publicity that King or the government or others wanted?
It's not what King's looking for. No, he's looking for, he's looking to either map how you can get the mining strike and get rich. There's a guy I live in Philadelphia, and Jay, who's the famous wealthy guy, Jay Cook. Yeah, Jay Cook. Pretty sure Jay Cook was a big industrialist, and he kind of lost all his money in the crash of 1872, 4, whenever the big crash was in there. And but he found his way back through a King mining manual and became a railroad and giant industrialist again. He was not looking to show that, and nor were the mining operators interested in sharing the information between between industrial workers. However, it is, I've read research that showed that those early labor actions really, they formed that kind of wildcat labor power in the West that, continues, frankly, to this day. That's an incredibly enduring thing. And I know in books you've edited, I mean, just that idea that people have struggled to stay in a place, that there's an incredible durability of that struggle into present times. And so some of those people working in O'Sullivan's photos are part of that.
So that's in 1867 on the 1867 at the King expedition where he's doing the Comstock
67, 68, yeah.
He also photographs people in the 71 expedition. He photographs like native people. How did that play? There were other people that eventually, I guess a couple decades later, like Edward Curtis. There's lots of other famous photographers who photograph native peoples. People don't think O'Sullivan. At least I don't when I think of, famous photographs of native peoples. How is maybe he approaching that subject differently during that 1871? And then was also 1873 is when he went to New Mexico and Canyon de Chelly and all that.
Yeah. I guess I was going to write this book in 6 months. That's what I told my publisher. A lot of things happened.
Famous last words.
Yeah, a lot of things happened, including that I kind of got laid up. I couldn't work for a while, year, 2. But I recovered. And although this is an audio podcast, which is a good thing, I look amazing now. But everything went kind of wrong on this book. It was going to be 6 months because I said to my the closest editorial person in my life, i.e. my wife, I said, honey, really, I've thought about these photographs, since we were married. So it's been decades. And it was always hard because, it was always like, well, what can you say about them? You no matter how much research I do, I won't be able to say anything about them. So I have to let them, I have to go out and let them.
He didn't write down in a detailed journal, well, I took this photograph and from this view because of X, Y, and Z, and here's why I included this.
No, because he was cranking out photos, and like his hands were tired from rowing on the Colorado River, where that
upstream, by the way, for readers.
Yes, upstream. I want to say
this moronic expedition of Death Valley during the summer then says, hey, let's one up ourselves and go up the Colorado,
which has already been explored. There's no reason for us to do this, but I want to make a name for myself. And everybody's going to kill this commander because we're rowing upstream. And also the commander crashes the boats. And the only people who know how to row the boats are, in fact, the indigenous rowers, who are left out of the photographs, who are in the photographs in the Library of Congress, but not identified. So it's like 5 people standing next to a boat, and 3 of them are identified in the credits. 2 of them are just, it's as if they're not there, although they're
just part of the landscape. They're not.
Right. Yeah. Right. And that's right. And that's a big thing.
But he does do some photographs just of like portraits. Yeah, almost.
He does. And I think it's a big mistake that we don't kind of include him in how we look at photographs of Native Americans. I mean, there are obviously Native American photographers. My current favorite, I keep going back to him, is a guy named Zig Jackson, who's a photographer now, but he photographed in the 70s. His photographs are kind of amazing. I just did a piece for the New Yorker magazine about a guy named Jeremy Dennis, who's a Shinnecock tribal nation member and is a photographer. And there's amazing examples of Native American photographers for all around time. But, we most often look at Curtis's photos, and he's photographing at the height of when the American government is beginning termination process, legislation, trying to get rid of tribes, trying to say, oh, we'll make you all American citizens and maybe you'll go away or you'll blend in. That's the big thing that many Americans want, that the government wants, is for tribes to kind of, well, we'll just bring you in and you'll be part of the great stream of American river. And great, I kind of quote, I have some great responses to that, I think, that I've quoted of Native American leaders in the book. But the point is that O'Sullivan's making photographs, a slew of photographs for this guy, Wheeler. And yeah, he's in Canyon de Chelly and he's in the fort and he's talking to people who are coming to trade at the port. And I think that they're very human photographs. Again, Curtis photographs people in a way that is, on the one hand, people are dressed up in their quote unquote traditional wear.
They're very staged.
They're very staged, of course.
Yeah.
But we know that it's kind of part of like he's saying these people are vanishing. I better get a photograph of them. They're vanishing. And O'Sullivan's photos say, oh, look, these people are working outside the fort. They're making blankets. They've been doing that for years. They get yarn from Pennsylvania. And then they sell it to these guys who come through here and they live here. This is how they support living here. And by the way, all of the people photographed in the Navajo photographs have just renegotiated with the U.S. Army to come back to their home after the Army took them away. Nobody talks about that. I mean, many Navajo talk about that, but nobody who's not Navajo is saying, oh, look, this is an amazing photo of them as they retake their land back.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm shouting for podcast listeners at home, but it's incredible. And, if you look at Brady, how Brady photographed people, he photographed people stately and they would look to the side, noble statesmen and senators and the relation of George Washington. He photographed them with these noble poses. You don't photograph people head on staring in the camera. Brady photographed what he called Fiji cannibals doing that as a kind of almost Barnum-esque, because they were actually visiting Barnum Circus, the quote-unquote Fiji cannibals, a term that is not true. But, these photographs of people at the Navajo, at the fort, are quite beautiful and noble. And it raised the question, well, O'Sullivan's family, certainly people he knew, had been forced to move off their land by a giant land clearance policy, which was based on starving people in Ireland. So it is of big interest to me that in the 1840s, late 1840s, the people who write about land clearance policies that the British government are enacting in Ireland are the ones who kind of get it right, are primarily the Cherokee and Choctaw writers.
Yeah, the Choctaws, they send money to Ireland to help alleviate suffering and the famine, right? There's this interesting historical connection. You suspect that maybe that's in O'Sullivan's mind? Maybe, if only he'd kept a better journal, right?
What I know is that people are still talking about Irish-English relations in Irish families in America. And I have a friend who recently passed away. His name is Mick Maloney. He's from Ireland, and he traveled the U.S. with songs about the famine and songs about people moving to America, really sad, beautiful ballads. And when he did that, all across the West, people would come out and say, these are the stories that we're taught not to talk about. In a way, silence turns out to be the most important thing to listen for. That's why the Salt Lake desert photo that is of nothing says so much to me. And letting water speak, his photos of water, even when there isn't water. I mean, in a way, Salt Lake feels like a water photo, even though there's no water there. But that idea of letting silence speak. And then, of course, that gets us back to, I've never done a pun in the title, but this is it. Here's a soldier who's exposed to the war. We're all exposed to whatever our family's exposed to. He's been land clearanced. And now he comes to this place where these people have returned to their land. I mean, in the 1870s, the Irish are trying to reestablish Ireland via Irish communities in the United States. So Irish nationalism is kind of, Eamon de Valera, the first president of Ireland, of the New Ireland is, I think he was born in New York.
Hmm.
So there's that very interesting, we'll things up with immigrants. But I think one of the biggest things about the Choctaw and the Cherokee writing in their newspapers about the Irish famine, writing in, I always say, in Choctaw and Cherokee, but also in English so that the heathen can read it too, is that, because it's in English, to be clear, the Friends, the Quakers who are supporting Native Americans charitably are saying this gift by the Choctaw to Ireland proves that we've civilized them. We've made them civilized. They understand charity. But that's not what they write in the Choctaw and Cherokee papers. They say this is a state that has made people move off their land. This rings a bell for us.
Hmm.
They're saying that not too many years after they've been removed to what is Indian territory at first.
Well, it's interesting that in some ways, O'Sullivan then is documenting all kinds of things that we're generally not supposed to document, right? Be it unsafe mining conditions, these native peoples they are still a little bit staged, but kind of just more in their natural element. The emptiness of some of these landscapes. You write about how sometimes he made the landscape look like dismembered body parts or related. There was something wrong with this landscape. It didn't look natural. Or, the one photo of something about a sand dune, and there's the
sand dune photo,
a wagon, so in this photograph, there's a big, huge sand dune, and in front of it, there's this wagon, which you can see the tracks. It has turned around and then stopped, which I don't know if he was trying to be poetic, but in my mind, I'm thinking this is the end of the road and they've decided to turn back. There's nothing to be had here, right? It's this desolate landscape. That seems like a photograph that would pop up. There'd be like a Dorothea Lange photograph, right? Documenting the failures, all the things that we're not supposed to talk about.
Yeah.
And that kind of seems to pop up, or like his Civil War photographs of just fields full of corpses.
Yeah, they're all photographs that you wouldn't take. Don't take that photograph.
Yeah, but he takes them.
Yep, he takes them. And yeah, the sand dune photo is tremendous. I just find it tremendously moving. And the more I and in going to the sand dune, it was my first trip after being sick for a long time. And it was my first trip away from home. It was one of those things where I had this kind of bad neurological thing. And I was like, am I going to make it? I did make it. I made it. But, and I'm laughing about it now. And I could even laugh a little then. I was like in a 110-degree desert looking for a sand dune, and I didn't even know where it was. And in retrospect, it was super easy to find it. But the dune is a really weird anomaly. It's this giant 2-mile-long sand dune, still there, that is composed of flakes of the Sierra Nevadas that have all collected in this stretch. There's no sand dunes around it. It's a 2-mile-long stretch of sand dune. It's crazy. It's like a creature. And the more you learn about it, the more people who live there and have lived there for a long time think of it as a creature. And it also is a singing sand dune. It sings in the right humidities. In the right humidity.
When the wind hits it, it puts off a certain tone.
There's a tone.
Like whistles.
Which I did not get to hear, but I heard lots of things. And in going to the sand dune, I was able to find the work of a woman named Margaret Wheat, who was a good friend of another woman in the neighborhood who was Paiute. And they drove around in the 1950s and 60s, I guess, and just talked about the land and talked about what the Paiute names for places were. And this sand dune, through it, I heard a lot about things that heal, and ways that land heals and heals us and so forth. And anyway, that photograph, to think about like a guy who had been through the war. And, I had recently, before I went out on that trip, I had been about a year or two before, I guess, with a photographer who was a war photographer, who had been in Iraq and had been very near a big explosion that had hurt him, but he survived. And we went on another trip together in a really complicated, difficult place. And it was hard for him. And it was hard for me, being a person near somebody who I really liked a lot, and seeing how hard it was for him. And to think about that with O'Sullivan going to this dune and watching the land being taken away from people and what that meant and how it was working. And now the violence that is in that place, because this dune, it turns out now, is in a military test site. What does that tell you? By the way, when military test sites were, like, it's one of the early sites when they were all moved from the east, moved from New Jersey, a half-hour drive from the high school that I learned about geology from the USGS maps, weirdly. The first big armory was in New Jersey, and it exploded in the 19-teens when lightning hit it. So they moved it west. So that's that idea of like double exposure, like being exposed to the plates, being exposed to violence. What is the violence we're all being exposed to that we're not allowed to talk about, that we don't get to talk about, that we don't know enough to talk about, that we're so distracted we don't even know we're both wearing ear sets now, so I could say this, but like, when I go for a walk down to the river in the morning or a jog down to the river, everyone's wearing headphones, meaning they can't feel the world, because hearing is touch. That's what I learned at the dune. Hearing is touch. That sounds crazy, but
well, we've jabbered on for a whole hour.
I think we're 2 hours over.
I have two kind of final thoughts, and I want to ask you about what you're working on next. The first is O'Sullivan. Historians, we always want all of historical figures to have kept better records and to have recorded like more introspective, journals and diaries or letters. But he's up there on the list of missed opportunity. Really wish we had more on him, because you've done a lot of exploration. And you're right, this is not a biography. This is not the purpose of your book, to tell his story. It's a survey of these landscapes. But man, I would like someone to find in a dusty old attic, some records from him, because I think
there's
a
the
lot
yes
more
and
here.
no. I don't want to be. If I'm afraid that if I knew too much, then I wouldn't like his. You know what I mean?
Oh, maybe, yeah. But the other thing I wanted to say is, it is really fascinating how his photographs and through his life, it ties together. Yeah, the violence of the Civil War. A lot of Western historians, we've been saying for a while that the Civil War was a war about westward expansion, right? It's a war of empire. But then we have him out here photographing mining, photographing landscapes that are in the middle of being taken away from native peoples and their dispossession. He ties together so many fascinating, or like he's there when he's not photographing Chinese railroad workers. He's there. His life ties together so much of the violence and the tension inherent in this really turbulent era, mid to late 19th century. You can see it all through him. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and 1870, when he comes back to the East, workers are about to go on strike. There's what is possibly the first general strike in the U.S. throughout the railroads, and the militias are called out. But the militias won't fire on the railroad workers. Why? Because they're railroad workers. They're workers, and so the National Guard at that point is reorganized. Or McKinley signs a law too, or executive order that says we're going to call the workers part of the industries, so you can shoot at them. It's fine, because they're by striking they're destroying property. So so all of the stuff we're talking about today, when's it right to bring out troops, all that stuff's happening in O'Sullivan's moment. And I wrote the book imagining, he helps us imagine that the Civil War wasn't civil, because of course it wasn't called that at all. And what is civil? I've written a book about Thoreau. Thoreau didn't call it civil disobedience. He called it resistance to civil government, almost a joke in civil government there. But what is resistance? So here we put down, to use the early term, the war of rebellion. So we put down the Confederate rebellion, and then the war moves west, and what rebellions does it put down? And when is I've been working for weeks to try to, how do you say, the government is as powerful when it's putting down a rebellion as when it's choosing not to put down a rebellion. And there's that idea that the Western settlers are as good at keeping back. I think I wrote about this here. Yeah. In the book, I mentioned Patricia Nelson Limerick, and she argues, I'm sure you know this, that white Westerners, her phrase is, centralize their resentments much more efficiently than the federal government centralized its powers. So it's looking at those two powers, and then always the native space and what's becoming native law, and native writings, which are so often people don't even, many, people like me who grew up in New Jersey and were told that things were all in the past, don't know to look at native writings in 1872. But yeah, so O'Sullivan's, you're able to think, you can watch him literally follow the war machine. The same guy, he was making maps during the war. So now he's out helping the map makers in the West. Civil War wasn't civil. If the South didn't win, they shook hands with the North. Many of the Confederate generals, the Confederate leaders, are either out there or with armies across the new Mexican border. And Grant's very nervous about that when O'Sullivan's out there. And the war proceeded west. And what I find too, it's always like when I have friends in California and friends in New York, and they're like, those Californians, or, vice versa, those New Yorkers. Living in Philadelphia, I've come to understand that our water, which we take from the Schuylkill River and the Delaware River, we didn't have a lot of money when we built our reservoir system, our water system in the 1860s, so we couldn't build a giant reservoir off-site as they did in New York. But so we drink from the Delaware. New York has expanded its reservoir system. Now they built reservoirs when I was a kid in the 60s. They trap Delaware water. So in a drought, Philadelphia has to ask the Supreme Court sometimes for New York to release its water. Now, the people who built New York's first reservoir systems went west and did the Hetch Hetchy system and did all kinds of water systems out there. And I think Clarence King helps us see, as does this other guy, Wheeler, that these are Easterners coming out with a vision of the West and kind of performing their vision of the West. And also that idea that the military kept all their weapons just north of my high school, the Kittatinny Ridge, where I took my driver's test, and on St. Patrick's Day and whatever, and that was all moved west. That it's just that there's, in a way, there's no difference. The East and the West have so much in common, so that a real estate conversation here is related to a real estate conversation there. And everybody thinks in the East, water issues are all in the West. No. They were set up by Easterners in the West. And there's still relations, East and West. Wall Street's watching the water.
Yep.
All right.
I mean, if you like to have your lettuce or any other produce, then, and if you want that in the East, then you probably need to be concerned about water in the West, right? Like,
yeah.
It's all connected.
And we're obviously, like, all of the operations. Yeah, I'll stop there. Sorry. I was just, Operation Wetback is an example of the federal power being employed to do something that we would never do that because everybody's upset about today. Well, no, we actually have done it many times, and it's under the name of war, and it's about land clearance and bringing people into land. And that's why Shoshone Falls is really interesting, because they brought in the Japanese. They brought in people from Mexico to do the work. Then they asked the Japanese to do the beach farming while they were there. And that's if I could say one more thing before I leave you alone. To me, the excruciatingly interesting thing about O'Sullivan is that things line up, that where we take land, where the U.S. government takes land, claims land, where they allot land to Native nations, Native communities, and where they build internment camps, concentration camps for Japanese Americans during the war. Those sites, things line up excruciatingly clearly. For me anyway, after going out and trying to literally look through O'Sullivan's lens. But let's look at his lens than try to be like his photographic plate, which is almost a 19th century trope. And so many folk songs say, like, if my heart was made of glass, from the 1800s, or if there's a lot about glass taking in impressions, which is a beautiful thing. There's something that's in the photo that we can't see all the time, to speak metaphorically, and perhaps way too obscurely.
So that's what writers do. That's my only
not claim to fame. That's my only expertise here is I go out and try to figure out how to say something in a different way.
I love it. Well, thanks for spending some time with us. I know it's a busy time for you right now, and I appreciate it. Congrats on the book. Congrats on some of the praise it's getting, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X Twitter. On those platforms, you can get updates, leave comments, and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream on our YouTube and Facebook pages, have an annual funding cycle with awards, grants, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at Redd Center, that's REDD Center.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is also linked in the show notes. As the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, you can direct any praise or critique my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. My recent books include a 2018 volume, Native Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. A 2019 anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I also recently launched and will be editing a new series for the University of New Mexico Press entitled The West in Context. Send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also the general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written micro-histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink.org, email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on Blue Sky or X Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, be kind. Cheers.